Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. For this episode, I am going to actually take a look at two short pieces of work, both of which are taken out of Michael Long's Christian Peace and Nonviolence, which we've been using for a lot of the works this season, as he has a wonderful compilation of nonviolent voices and literature from throughout the last 2 millennia, Christian voices in particular. And the two works that I'm selecting are separated by about a millennia, and they're actually going to be contrasting pieces of work. The first one that I'm going to look at is Humbert of Romans, and the second work that I'm going to look at is by Paulinus of Nola. So before we get into the weeds here, let me go ahead and acknowledge both of these sources. I will also put this in writing so you can take a look at everything. But for Humbert of Romans, this is found in the book Catholic Peacemakers, and it is Humbert's A Work in 3 Parts, which is translated by Ronald G. Musto and published by the Taylor and Francis Group LLC. It is reproduced with permission of the licensor through PLSclear. And for Paulinus of Nola, this is excerpts from letter 18, Letters of St. Paulinus of Nola, Volume 1, translated and annotated by P.G. Walsh, pages 175 through 177, copyright 1966 by Reverend Johannes Quasten, Reverend Walter J. Burkhart, and Thomas Comerford Lawler, published by Noonan Press, an imprint of Paulist Press, Incorporated, New York, Mahawa, New Jersey. Okay, so we are actually going to start with the later work, which is by Humbert of Romans, and this was written, in the late 1200s or so. And what's particularly interesting, what you're going to hear from this work, is that it is not at all a pacifist work. It is not a nonviolent work. And in fact, is very anti-nonviolence. It's written at a time, I believe, during the Second Crusade, or thereabouts, where the Pope is asking Humbert to basically draft up a propaganda document, hey, we need to recruit some people, help me out here. And so Humbert is kind of railing against the nonviolent people and calling them not Christians and trying to get them, anti-propaganda against them, right? Trying to kind of discredit them. And what's interesting about that, one of the reasons I want to include this, is because you can see that one of the most damaging things today against Christianity, a lot of people are going to say, well, yeah, look at the Christians and the Crusades and Christendom and how terrible it was. And it's yeah, there's a lot of truth to that, but that's a strand of Christianity. Sure, it was a large strand. Christendom is a very large strand, but you also have these other strands that are always continually running underneath the surface of Christendom and power mongering and all of that stuff. And this article by Humbert of Romans kind of shows that these other groups exist. And over the last couple of years, I've become more and more a fan of Kierkegaard, and this is very Kierkegaardian, right? This idea that you have this undercurrent of true Christianity, this sectarian Christianity, which oftentimes ends up, in some ways, even though it's viewed as unorthodox, at least in some ways, maintaining more orthodoxy, at least in their orthopraxy. So without further ado, here is Humbert of Romans, short work in 3 parts, some excerpted text here. Number 10. It should be noted that there are certain people given to hate, fleeing all labors for Christ, who are used to protesting the campaigns that the Church has taken up against the Saracens. They are like those who are used to passing judgment on everyone else, while they themselves know how to do nothing. So with their dissent, certain of these dissuade many from the path that leads to heaven, namely that of the crusade, and cause them to remain with them in their inertia. What is worse, they are like heretics who are used to making many jokes about those taking such a pilgrimage, and about those returning, and those who have sustained misfortunes. 11. There are certain of these protesters who say that it is not proper for the Christian religion to thus shed blood, even that of evil infidels, for Christ did not do so. To the contrary, when he was arrested in the garden, he did not threaten or resist, and he surrendered to him who judged him unjustly, as Peter says. Nor did Christ teach this. On the contrary, he said to Peter, who wished to defend him, "Put your sword in its sheath." Nor did the apostles do this. On the contrary, they went rejoicing from their court appearances, since they were ready to suffer physical outrage for the name of Christ. And not only did the apostles teach this, for this reason Paul said to the Romans, "Do not defend yourselves, beloved. How much greater are they who do not resist?" And Peter, "Do not repay evil for evil, nor curse for curse, but bless those who curse you." Not even the holy martyrs used violence. On the contrary, Mauritius, with his entire Theban legion of Christian soldiers, did not resist their killers. And the same can be said for the innumerable other martyrs, who indeed hurried to martyrdom, and for God's sake were murdered, and were considered like lambs for sacrifice. The ancient fathers did not even teach this violence. And there are innumerable authorities of holy authors, of popes and councils that appear to condemn wars. From these, then, it is concluded that the Christian religion, which ought to follow the example and doctrine of Christ and the saints, ought not to any degree enter into war through which so much blood is spilled. Number 12. There are those who say that even if Saracen blood is not to be spared, nevertheless the blood spilling and death of Christians should be prevented. But in this type of pilgrimage against the Saracens, innumerable Christians die, as much on the high seas as through disease, as in war, as from scarcity or excess of food, and not only common folk, but also kings and princes and people very precious to Christendom, as in the case of King Louis. What wisdom is there in exposing such people to death and of emptying Christendom of so many and such good people? Others say that when our people go across the sea against the Saracens, the conditions of war are much worse for us, for there we are very few in comparison to their multitude. Again, we are in a strange land, they in their own. Again, we are in an unaccustomed climate, they in an accustomed one. Again, we have to use many kinds of strange food, but they are used to them. They know the terrain, the dangerous and winding passes, but we don't. We frequently lack supplies there. They, however, have an abundance. And so it appears to be tempting to God, or to be a great lack of faith, to enter such a conflict. Therefore, since wisdom is the highest necessity in war, it appears that wars of this type should never be attempted by Christians. There are those who say that even if we ought to defend ourselves against the Saracens when they invade us, nevertheless, when they leave us in peace, it does not seem that we ought to invade them. 15. There are some who say, if we're supposed to wipe the Saracens off the earth, why not do the same to the Jews? And why don't we do the same to the Saracens whom we have under our power? Why don't we persecute with the same zeal other pagans who still inhabit the world? Why don't we also do the same to the Tartars and to the barbarian nations of this type who are all infidels? Some say, what use is there in this campaign against the Saracens? For they will not be led to conversion in this way, but more strongly provoked against the Christian faith. Again, when we conquer and kill them, we send them to hell, which appears to be against charity. Again, when we take their lands, we do not hold those who populate and cultivate them, since our own people do not want to remain in those parts. And thus it does not appear that there is any fruit, either spiritually, materially, or temporally, from all this expedition. Some say that it does not appear to be the will of God that Christians should proceed thus against the Saracens, because of the misfortunes that God has permitted and permits to happen to the Christians in pursuit of this campaign. For how could God permit that Saladin, in 1187, could so quickly take from us again almost the entire land, taken with so much Christian blood and sweat, and the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, heading to the rescue, should perish in a puddle of water, and that King Louis of happy memory be captured in Egypt with his brother and almost all of the nobility of France in 1250, and again, starting off on the Tunisian campaign, was killed with his son, and that so many of the ships returning from there, but the survivors were sunk in the storm off Sicily, and that such a huge army accomplished nothing, and the same for innumerable similar armies, if God favored such proceedings. It should be said that those who talk like this don't yet really understand God's ways. Like, if you took off the first and last paragraph of this piece of work, you would think that the author was like making a case for how terrible the Crusades were and how unchristian they were, right? Like he's listing out all of these arguments from people against the Crusades and against doing violence to the Muslims, the quote infidels. It's just fantastic. It's amazing that he can write all of these things where you're like, yeah, that's right. But his conclusion is, what did he say? He said, it should be said that those who talk like this don't really understand God's ways. He's like, yeah, I know what all you're saying. Okay, so, Jesus didn't act like that. Okay, none of the apostles acted like that. Okay, the saints didn't really act like that. All right, it doesn't look like we're really succeeding. Okay, when we kill them, we're sending them to hell. I don't think that's really charity, right? I'll have to, I forget exactly how he said it. He said, it appears to be against charity, right? I mean, how crazy. Like, he's saying all of these things, and you're like, yeah, this is all right. And then he just says, those who talk like this don't really understand God's ways. And at the very beginning, he says, they're like those who are used to passing judgment on everyone else while they themselves know how to do nothing. So essentially saying that, like, these people who are making all of these criticisms, he's like, well, they're passing a lot of judgment. Like, they're so judgmental, but look, they're not doing anything for the kingdom, right? They're not getting on boats. They're not going out and conquering. They're not fighting the infidels, right? They just make all of these judgmental claims against us. And that's what people levy at pacifists today still, is that you're passive, right? Pacifists. And it's just interesting to see that there's apparently a relatively strong strain of this kind of stuff in Christianity during the time of the Crusades. I know St. Francis lived around this time, and he made a nonviolent incursion into enemy territory and to one of the sultans, I believe, and earned some respect there. But I had never known that it was as big as Humbert seems to think it is, that it's necessary to kind of be writing against. But one other thing I want to point out here, which I think is just so illuminating as to what Christendom really is. But in segment 12, Humbert is talking about how one of the arguments against the Crusades is that so many Christians die. Like, not only enemies, we shouldn't kill them, but also, like, you're sending a lot of Christians to death, and just meaningless death, dying in shipwrecks and disease and all of this kind of thing. And one of the things that Humbert says is that not only common folk die, but also kings and princes and people very precious to Christendom, as in the case of King Louis, right? Who are those who are really precious to Christendom? He had just gotten done talking about martyrs and apostles who laid down their lives, even for the enemies. They laid down their lives in martyrdom. And now he's saying the people who are precious in Christendom are the kings and the princes. Right? There's not a clearer depiction of what Humbert's type of thinking, of what Empire's type of thinking, of what Christendom's type of thinking gets you. And this is something that we've seen and will continue to see, especially one of my favorite works from this season is going to be our last one right before Memorial Day, which is entitled The Unknown Soldier by, I think it's Harry Fosdick. And you're going to see even more of this where the poor come into light. A lot of the critiques done by those who are nonviolent point out that it's the poor who bear the brunt of all of this stuff. Not only they're the ones conscripted and they're the ones who end up dying, but they're also the ones whose fields get burned. They're the ones who don't get the food while the kings do. So reading this work by Humbert of Romans is, it's almost like, it feels like you're sort of reading the satire, and then you recognize, oh, this guy's serious. And it's sad and it's terrible, and it's still happening today because we're still in Christendom, basically. Okay, a work that I want to kind of put this up against, put Humbert of Romans, I want to pit him against here, is this work by Paulinus of Nola, which comes from poem 17 and letters 18 and 25. And what you're going to see here is that Paulinus was an interesting person who advocated nonviolence, but just a little bit of his background from Long's work here is that he indicates that he was a friend of Martin of Tours, Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine. Those are some really interesting people to be friends with, and some people that we reference throughout our seasons, especially Augustine and Martin of Tours. Those are two big names that have come up quite a bit here, usually on different ends of the spectrum. Augustine with his justification of war to a certain extent, and Martin of Tours with his laying down of arms. So I'll just go ahead and read the work from Paulinus, and then we can discuss it a little bit more. You will journey through the territory of Philippi in Macedonia, and through the city of Tomai. You will be a visitor from Troy to the Scupi, who border on your land. With what cries of joy will that land now ring when you teach those Arctic peoples to bend their fierce necks to the gentle Christ, where the north wind binds the rivers with thick frost in Riphean lands. You thaw minds stiff with ice by your heavenly fire. For the Bessians, whose minds are harder than their lands, who indeed are harder than their own snow, have now become sheep, and you lead them as they flock to the hall of peace. Those necks which they always refused to bow to slavery, since they were always unsubdued in war, they now rejoice to bend in submission to the yoke of the true Lord. Now the Bessians are richer, and delight in the reward of toil. The gold which they previously sought from the earth with their hands, they now gather with their minds from heaven. What a change and happy transformation in the world! Those mountains, once trackless and blood-stained, now protect brigands turned monks, pupils of peace. The land once drenched in blood is now the land of life. The violence of brigands is turned devotedly towards heaven, and Christ smiles on the plundering which lays hold of heaven's kingdom. Where once existed the rule of beasts, there is now the vigorous life of angels. The just man now lives his hidden life in the caves where the brigand dwelt. The plunderer of old is become the plunder of holy men, and the murderer groans because the losses he inflicted are reversed, for Christ despoils him, and he is rightly stripped of the weapons of sinning. With the fall of Satan, the envious Cain perishes in turn, and Abel reborn feeds the lambs redeemed at the cost of flowing blood. Well done, Nicetas, goodly servant of Christ, who permits you to transform stones into stars and to build consecrated temples on rocks that live. You tread trackless glades and deserted ranges in your search for the way. You prevail over the barren woodland of unkempt mines, and you transform it into fertile fields. The whole region of the north calls you farther. The Scythians become gentle at your words. At war with each other, they abandon their aggressive spirit under your schooling. Your work is the creation of calves from wolves, and the feeding with hay of lion and ox yoked together, and the opening of dens of vipers to children without harm. For you persuade wild beasts to join with domesticated animals, and to abandon their fierce ways when you flood men's wild minds with your civilizing discourse. In this mute region of the world, the barbarians, through your schooling, learn to make Christ's name resound from Roman hearts, and to live in purity and tranquil peace. So the wolf lies tamed in your sheepfold, the calf eats in harmony with the lion, the child plays in those grim caves from which the snake has been driven. I'm sure you can tell from that part there that was the poetry Paulinus's poem there, with all the beautiful language, bringing in some of this prophetic imagery of what the Messiah will do on earth, and it's reminiscent of, I think it's Justin Martyr. I don't remember exactly, but talking about how, look, God said, or Joel says, or somebody says that the swords will be turned into plowshares and everything. Behold, that day has come. Like, we're here. The kingdom of God is here, and the Christian community, the Christian kingdom, has done this. Like, the Christian community had beaten swords into plowshares, and they refused to take up implements of war. So a lot of Paulinus's imagery there was just beautiful and reminiscent of that sort of vision that the early Christian community had. So now we're going to move on into his letter 18. But by what paths did he lead you to the way of his truth? He schooled you first in duties of the flesh to lead you to the spiritual tasks of his virtue. He first appointed as soldier one whom he later chose as bishop. He allowed you to fight for Caesar so that you could learn to fight for God, in order that whilst exercising your bodily vigor in the work of the army, you could strengthen yourself for spiritual battle, reinforcing your spirit to confess the faith and hardening your body for suffering. Your subsequent abandonment of military service and your entry into the faith showed that divine providence had attached to you an important design. As soon as you were fired with love for Christ, the Lord himself arranged a display of his activity. You marched on to the parade ground on the day designated for military assembly. You were clad in all the adornment of the armor of war which by then you had mentally rejected. All were admiring your most punctilious appearance and your awe-inspiring equipment, when suddenly the army gaped with surprise. You changed direction, altered your military oath of allegiance, and before the feet of your impious commanding officer you threw down the arms of blood to take up the arms of peace. Now that you were armed with Christ, you despised weapons of steel. Straightway the commander was roused to fury by the venom of the serpent of old. You were stretched out for scourging and beaten with huge sticks, but you were not conquered, because you leaned on the wood of the cross. Next, your physical pain was redoubled. Your limbs, lacerated by great blows, were stretched out over sharp fragments of earthenware. But Christ gave you softer support, for his bosom was your bed and his right hand your pillow. So before your wounds were healed, you advanced eagerly and more bravely on a greater enemy, for you were restored by courage, which was fired rather than broken by the pain of your wounds. You were handed over to the commanding general, but your triumph over this more powerful enemy was more glorious still. The clients of the devil did not dare to pile on further the torture which you had overcome, but they mooted the death penalty so that their defeats might end at any rate with the termination of your bodily life. But our Lord, who is strong and mighty and unconquered in battle, shattered their hearts, however obstinate, with notable miracles. For on that journey on which you followed your assassin as a sacred victim, the executioner with menacing taunts laid a rash hand on your neck, stroking with a hand which sought to foreshadow the sword the spot where the blow would strike. But there and then his eyes were torn from him, and he was struck with blindness. What love Christ's indescribable goodness proffers to his own. This next, just last little paragraph or two is from letter 25. In this piece, Paulinus is counseling a soldier to stop shedding blood. Do not go on loving this world and the military service that is part of it, because Scripture bears witness that anyone who is a friend of the world is an enemy of God. The man who fights with the sword is an agent of death, and whoever sheds his own blood or someone else's will have death as his wages. He will be responsible for his own death or for the crime of bringing it on another, because, of necessity, the soldier in war, even though he fights for someone else rather than himself, either meets death in defeat or attains victory through killing. One cannot be victorious except through shedding blood. For this reason, the Lord says you cannot serve two masters, that is, both the one God and Mammon, both Christ and Caesar, although Caesar himself now wants to be the servant of Christ in order that he might deserve to be ruler over certain nations. For no earthly king is king of the whole world. That belongs to Christ, who is God, because all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made. He is both the King of kings and the Lord of lords. He does whatever he wishes on earth, in the sea, and in the depths. So one of the reasons I wanted to include these two works here was to, first of all, to provide a little bit of diversity in regard to kind of the eras that we're talking about. And I thought it was good. We had a lot of more modern resources, and I thought that hearing some older resources would be good, especially from the time of the Crusades, to show that there was a running stream of sectarian pacifism, even when Christendom was very strong and pretty brutal. But the second reason is because really Paulinus was writing at a somewhat similar time as the time of the Crusades, in some way. And so I think it's important to kind of compare these two documents. When Humbert of Romans was writing, this was the time of the Crusades, right? The Second Crusade. Christendom had some power, but there was a lot of threat of Muslim invasion. The Muslims were gaining power, throughout the world. So there was strength, but also fear. Now, Paulinus actually lived at a very similar time, because he was alive in the late 300s, all the way to, I believe, about 435, 439, something like that. And so Paulinus lived through, the infamous sacking of Rome, and then there were some other places that fell within or around his lifetime. For instance, Salvian wrote the book On the Government of God after a significant fall, I believe, in Toulouse, France. And he wrote On the Government of God, I think partly in response to that, or at least, with all of these events going on around, where you've got these barbarians who are coming in and striking fear in the Roman people, and a people who at this point are quite a lot of Christians. They're composed of a lot of Christians, even so much so that you've got Augustine, who's in power, who is writing the City of God because he's defending Christianity. While Salvian, a little bit later, is actually condemning Christianity and saying, hey, the barbarians are actually Christians, a lot of them, and they're actually better Christians than we Romans are, because we Romans are licentious and are just abhorrent. Like, we are not living like Christians. So there's a whole lot of uncertainty going on in the lifetime of Paulinus that are evoking works like the City of God and On the Government of God, and barbarians invading and cities falling. It's really scary. Yet Paulinus is advocating that soldiers not shed blood, and he is praising people for laying down their arms, and he is writing beautiful imagery about the kingdom of God and the way that Christians are to live. So I think stacking these two works on top of each other and viewing them together can help us to see one response that religion can have to fear and to power. And that is the response that we see in Humbert of Romans. Like, we can deny all of the truth of what Jesus taught, all of what the apostles showed us, all of what the saints showed us, all of what logic shows us, all of the injustice that violence brings and power breeds. And we can deny all those things and just say, well, yeah, you just don't understand God. Let us, right, the upper class, the elite, let us kind of tell you what to believe. Don't listen to all this other stuff. Don't listen to reason. And then you've got another response, which is the Paulinus and the early church, the ante-Nicene response, which is, hey, look, in the face of the greatest power ever known, Rome, before it's sacked, we'll lay down our arms. We'll refuse to join the ranks of power, and assert that over others, and we'll shed our blood. And by that, the blood of the martyrs became the seed of the church. And it's so sad to me that it's easy for atheists and critics of Christianity to take a look at people like Humbert and to take a look at the Crusades and all of the wicked popes and leaders of Christendom and all that stuff, and say that that is indicative of what Christianity actually is. When you've got this other beautiful strain of people who are prophetic witnesses resisting the allure of power and control. So I highly recommend you read these works in full. I also highly recommend that you pick up Michael Long's Christian Peace and Nonviolence, because it's a fantastic just collection of works. You're going to get people from all different eras, and from the liberal to conservative end of the spectrum. You're going to get all kinds of things in that, and that's just a sampling of what exists in the nonviolent literature.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.